¿Qué es el baño? No, dime.
¿Querés guardar?
Ah, no, esto es nuestro.
Claro, por eso guardar.
Sí, lo voy a guardar.
Después te queda acá, te lo olvidás, va a quedar acá. O sea, si lo olvidás, vas a tener que hacerte otro viaje hasta acá.
Ya me pasó. Ahora con la tarjeta de memoria, creo que fue el primer evento. La foto. Eso fue por ahí en junio. Me debí acá.
En agosto la buscaron, una cosa así.
No sé si usa el micrófono.
Va, bueno. Es un privilegio.
No. Vamos a ver. Cuando está prendido se prende esta luz. Sí,
Lo mantenés apretado y arranca el micrófono. Se vendría muy bien, porque si tomas vos, llegas a la tercera fila.
Ya, sí. Sí. Hubo muchos invitados también por parte de Mural, para que gente conocida, venía de entrada. No, ciudad que país, me queda yo. Otro bici. Yo dije allá, viste, la otra vez le dije, allá en Chile, claro, eso, mañana y tarde, y a la noche se hace un sidetrack de entonces yo le dije, che, si cobran la bici. ¿A la noche lo hace? Le dije a Alexis, si cobran la bici me chupo. Yo también. Sí, porque IDF, viste, también está en Chile. Va a tantos lados y van a hacer eso un evento al mismo tiempo. Bueno, sí. Sí, yo creo que de la charla. Sí, yo digo, para la parte esto va a ser toda la semana, inclusive va a ser los premios y lo van a hacer ahí Interaction Award. Sí. Sí, por eso yo decía que bien, decía, se van a comprar bici, se quieren nomás. Tal cual. Bien, sí. Sí, cualquier. 5 minutos. Bueno, vamos a arrancar. Se ve que no era muy duro. Se ve que no era muy duro. Bueno. No, sí. Era raro. Bueno. Sí, o bueno, cuando siempre. Sí. No. ¿Qué le dijo? Está mirando, ¿viste? Y no sabe qué pasó. ¿Qué le dijo? Yo le cumplí. Bueno. ¿Sabes qué tenés que hacer? Arrancamos 25 entonces. ¿Me fijo fuera si hay alguien más? ¿Me llamo? Sí. Dale, haz eso.
Avisales incluso a los que están parados que acá hay un montón de lugar.
Dale. Sí. Bueno, ya arrancamos, ¿eh? I have some six lines. Sorry, it's just the first step. That's it from London. It goes different after that. Let's see some new things. It might take a thing that sound familiar. Better for my memory to. I mean, what is it? Yeah, by email. That's it. ¿Quieres quedarte igual acá conmigo? Así me haces apoyo moral. Sí, no. No, está nervioso. ¿Algo? Sí.
¿Este es el link para el streaming?
Sí.
Todavía no empecé a ver. No, pero se lo voy a pasar a la que hace prensa.
Empezamos tarde. Empezamos muy tarde, por eso te vas. Bueno, arrancamos. Trabajando para el movimiento. Arrancamos. Cuando esté aquí. Bueno. ¿No? Ya que ya le arrancamos, Igual, ¿querés venir vos a ver primero? Dale, ven. Sí. Hola. Bueno, muchas gracias por haber venido. La verdad estamos muy contentos de poder tener un nuevo encuentro de IDF Buenos Aires. Ya casi es el último, ya cerramos el año, falta uno más en diciembre. Así que conforme vayan pasando las semanas, le vamos a dar un poco más de info. Primero y antes que nada, Lopa de Digital House va a tener unas palabras y después seguimos con la presentación.
¿Qué tal? Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. La verdad que en nombre de Digital House estamos muy contentos de poder ofrecer este espacio para generar este tipo de encuentros. Digital House, uno de los cursos que tiene es el diseño. Para tener y ayudar a la comunidad de diseño a crecer y a desarrollarse, ¿sí?, en Argentina. Así que los invito a todos, los interesados, después de la charla, a encontrarse conmigo para afuera para conocer de qué se trata el curso, o aquellos que están interesados también en colaborar desde algún lado, contenido, clases, también pueden hacerlo conmigo al final de la jornada. Así que, en nombre de Digital House, bienvenidos y gracias a IDF, thank you, Jim, bienvenidos.
Bueno, seguramente no están acá para escuchar a qué les puedo llegar a decir, sino para escuchar a Jim. Así que para quienes no lo conocen, Jim es autor, speaker, instructor en diseño de experiencia de usuario, arquitecto de información y estratega. Hoy por hoy Jim trabaja como Head of Customer Success en Mural y ha trabajado como líder de diseño y consultor en diferentes empresas como eBay, Audi, Sony, Lexus y Citrix. Fue editor de Boxes and Arrows, que es una revista online muy importante de experiencia de usuario, y ha sido miembro de la Junta Asesora del Instituto de Arquitectura y Información en 2005 y 2007. En 2007, Jim publicó su primer libro, Design Web Navigation, publicado por O'Reilly, y su último libro, hace unos meses, salió también por la misma editorial, que se llama Mapping Experience. Vive en New Jersey, toca el bajo en algunas bandas de jazz, y escribe en el blog que se llama experienceinformation.com. Y su Twitter es Jim Calvach, como tienen ahí. No hablo más, les prometo. Jim, todo tuyo.
Thanks, Sebastian. Great to be here. I just want to do a quick sound check. Is this okay for volume, President? Great, thanks. So, let's see. Is this going?
Should be.
No.
Check. Should have it.
Tienes que seleccionar la ventana.
Puede ser eso.
All right. Go. Yeah, thanks. Change focus, probably. So I think, I'm not sure, unfortunately I don't speak Spanish, but I think these are some of the things that Sebastian just talked about. Currently work at Mural, there's my Twitter handle. The author of these two books from O'Reilly. This book just came out in May of this year, and that's what we're going to be talking about tonight. Just a few topics from the book there, and I wanted to start with a quote from Steve Jobs. In 1997, he returned to Apple after having been asked to leave the company that he founded. And in a town hall meeting with everyone in the company, he said, you've got to start with the customer experience and work back towards the technology, not the other way around. There's a video of him saying that online. You can find that on YouTube. And I think it gave a little bit of insight into how he was going to turn Apple around in 1997. That he was essentially advocating a change in dynamics in how products and services are made. Start with the experience, work back towards the technology. And I think since then we've seen kind of an uptick of design and user experience and things like that that we all care about. Not because he said that, but I think this was kind of a point in time, an inflection point or an articulation of a new way of thinking about how business gets done. Start with the experience, work back towards the technology. A lot of people have written about this, but you know, when I think about this quote and what it could mean, the deeper meaning of it, I make a comparison to Copernicus, the famous Polish astronomer who discovered that the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around. And this was 1543. And people believed that the sun revolved around the Earth, right? But he said, no, actually, we're actually just a third planet from the sun, right? We're less important. And this was an important scientific discovery, of course, but it actually changed the psyche of the time. People started questioning their place in the universe. We're not the center of the universe anymore. And for me, I think that's what we're seeing, and I think that's why design and UX right now is very important. It's not just a nice to have; it's business critical, because we need to start with the experience and work back towards the technology. That's how we do good business. Steve Jobs taught us that. This diagram was created in 1543. It's actually an early example of an infographic by Copernicus, and basically he observed the outside world, right, through a telescope. He observed the planets. He wanted to express what he observed to other people, and he captured it in a diagram, right? So he observed the outside world, created a diagram to explain his model of the outside world. This isn't an accurate diagram, right? The planets aren't this far apart from each other, right? It's an abstraction. It's a representation. It's a model of the world that you can then use to have a conversation about how the world works. And I think that's what we do when we do things like this. This is actually a fairly complex diagram, but I was kind of reminded of Copernicus's diagram. This was created by some service designers. This is a type of a service ecosystem diagram, and it's for a car sharing app. And I realize you can't read that, but basically in the center is the customer, right? What is the customer doing, thinking, feeling? He has some questions out here: what, why, how, when, who, around car sharing in general. But thinking about the customer in the center, and then the next ring here is the customer with the passenger, so somebody riding in a car, and then it's how the next ring around is two cars on the road, and it goes all the way out to society. What is the meaning of car sharing for society, right? But it puts the customer in the center, right? So start with the experience and work back towards the technology, work back towards the business. So these are the kinds of things when we talk about mapping experiences, user experience, service design. When we talk about these things, we're really trying to change the equation of how we're creating products and services. And these diagrams help us do that. They help us capture an observation of the outside world and have a conversation about that outside world with our teams and with our companies. Typically, though, we see things that look more like this, right? We don't see those elaborate circle diagrams that I just talked about. We might see something like this. This is a customer journey map. How many people have heard of a customer journey map? Have heard that term before? That pretty good portion of you guys. That's good. How many people have actually made one or used one at work? That's a pretty good portion. Almost the same group of people. So customer journey map, as the name kind of implies, it's trying to look at the journey that a customer takes when they're interacting with a product or a service. And instead of a circle, this is more like a table, right? And at the top here, we have some phases of interaction. This is when the customer becomes aware of my service, how they get onboarded, then they're using the service, and then they might pay an invoice or contact support. So we come up with this model of the world. We observe the outside world, and we create a model of it so that we can have a conversation around the experience. The top part of this diagram here in this kind of teal color is really looking at our observations of the customer. Right, so here are actions, thoughts, and feelings, right? Desired outcomes, pain points. This is what we want to focus on in trying to describe what that experience is, right? Start with the experience, work back towards the technology. That's what this top part is describing, the experience. And then down below, what we have here are the activities that an organization is going to do in order to provide that service. So these diagrams typically have two parts to them. A part that describes the outside world, the individual, the person, and a part that describes what an organization has to do to provide a service to that. And where they meet in the middle, we call that touch points, or a line of interaction. And this basic pattern we see in lots of different types of diagrams. I'm going to show lots of examples coming up, but just think about that idea of trying to align the outside world with what a product or a service is trying to do. And that's really what these visualizations do. Now we've captured this. We've frozen something that's abstract, right? We talk about an experience. What is an experience? Who can define an experience? I can't even define what it is, right? What's a good definition of experience? When I ask that question, people say stuff that happens to human beings, right? That's right. So it's a very abstract concept to talk about, start with the experience and work back towards the technology. But I think this type of visualization makes it really concrete, right? But keep in mind that it's an abstraction. It's not reality. Just like Copernicus's diagram wasn't true. This is an abstraction. It's just a model. It's our understanding of the outside world. So these things are flexible, and there's no right or wrong way to create them. There's only an appropriate way, or a way that's going to make sense to the organization. The point that I want to make through the rest of the presentation is not about diagrams. So the book that I wrote really focuses on visualizations, and I just told you how important these visualizations are. But it's not the diagram itself that's going to give your organization the answers, right? The diagram is really just a place, it's just a way to have a conversation, right? It's really the conversations where all of the decisions are going to be made and where all of the importance is, right? So the diagram is a compelling document. By compelling, I mean it's something that's attractive. It's something that's visual. It's something that people want to engage with. Because we can observe the outside world and write a 10-page report or a 50-page report of our observations, and then send it off to people. And what happens when we do that? Right? Send a 10-page report of what you observed, right? People get to page 1 and don't read it anymore if they read any of it, right? Or if they read it, they're not able to make connections between page 7 and page 1, right? So a diagram like this one is a way to take a lot of information in a very compact way to present a lot of connections and observations and insights that we have about an experience. But it's not the diagram itself that's going to give you the answers. The diagram is a compelling way to invite others and engage in a conversation about, well, what is the experience? How do we start with that? And what's the technology that we have to then work out in order to provide a service? So what I want to talk about is a process, a generic process that I use in the book to describe how we go about mapping experiences. Whether you call it a service blueprint or a customer journey map or an experience map, there's all kinds of labels out there. I don't really care. Really, the important point is that you're trying to align the outside world with the inside world. And this is the process that I use in the book to describe how we go about doing that. The important point here is about how you engage other people, right? This isn't an activity that two people do, that one person does alone, and then they go, ta-da, here's my diagram, right? And then your audience, your stakeholders have no idea where that came from or what it's about. You want to engage people throughout this entire process. Because again, it's not about the diagram. There's no magic answers that fall out of the map, right? It's about engaging others in a conversation, making sense of the outside world. So it has 4 phases. It could have 5 or 6. It's kind of arbitrary, but it's just my model of talking about how we go about doing this. You initiate an effort, so you start. How do you get started? Then you do some investigation. That's the observations that you're going to make. Then you want to illustrate that. That's the visualization. And then finally, you want to envision a better future, right? So I just wanted to talk about those 4 steps and how you can engage others using mapping as a way to engage others in a conversation throughout the process. So the initiation phase, how do you get started? The goal here is really to make it relevant. One question that I get a lot is, what's a good example of a diagram? And really what's in that question is what's a good illustration, or what's a good visual diagram? And my answer is always, the best diagram is the one that made the best decisions for the organization, or that had the best conversations. It could be high fidelity, it could be something you do in Illustrator and looks great, but it could also just be sticky notes on the wall. Right? So there is no right or wrong answer. There's only relevant or not relevant. Are you mapping the world in a way that makes sense for the group of people that you're working with, whether it's an agile team or whether you're consulting a large company? It needs to be relevant. Might sound simple, but I've seen a lot of projects get off track and they're actually taking a picture of the world that's not relevant to the organization. So you need to match those two up. And the way that you do that is you answer these 5 questions. Well, you don't have to do it that way. That's the way I suggest you do it, is answer these 5 questions. I have a blog post about these 5 questions. I call them the 5 key questions for getting started with a mapping exercise. And the first one is, what's your point of view? Whose experience are you talking about and which experiences? You need to clarify that first. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not so obvious. If you're working in like a complex B2B situation, even just the question of whose experience are we talking about here is not always obvious, right? Is anybody working like B2B situations, like banks or anybody B2B? When I say B2B? Yeah. So you need to figure out whose experience you're mapping first. Also, what's the scope? When does the experience begin or end? What's the snapshot of the world that I'm looking at? What are you going to focus on? What elements are you actually going to notate in your diagram? How are you going to arrange it? And have some examples. Well, we already saw the circle, right? You could do a table. There's other arrangements. There's other ways to tell the story visually. Because it's really about visual storytelling. So you need to think about how are you going to tell that story, because that affects how you're going to do the next stage, which is observations. And then finally, before you get started, think about how you're going to use this. What are you actually going to do? You're going to have a workshop. You're going to print it out. You're going to involve people in one-on-one discussions. What are you actually going to do with this thing? Because that affects how you're going to go about doing the mapping as well too. So initiating is about making it relevant. And the point that I just made was, how do you involve other people at this stage? And there's this simple technique called stakeholder mapping, or creating a stakeholder map, which is trying to really get to that question, whose experience are we mapping? And this is there's no prescribed method for doing this. It's basically a large concept diagram where you indicate all of the actors and the main entities in the ecosystem that you've defined. So you need to scope that out. In this case, they're talking about a community organization with clubs and designers. So you put all of the different actors out here and all of the different associations and main players, and you see what their relationship is. And typically, when we map an experience, we're really just talking about the relationship of a community champion to the media. So you're usually just talking about 1, maybe 2 of those lines, but you're not mapping everything, because you need to be focused and you need to make it relevant. So something like a stakeholder map is something you can do with a group of people before you even start mapping. You can get together a group of stakeholders and talk about who are all these people that we could potentially look at their experiences of. Here's an example from Mural. I created this about a year and a half ago. It's very simple. We were just talking about, who are the main types of people that are involved in the Mural ecosystem. We have a lead, a design lead. They work with a team, product managers. And after they work, then they have senior managers or engineers that they push their work out to. There might be a manager of the design team, and then there's an IT manager as well too. It's just a super high level picture of the ecosystem. But again, the point here, this is something you can do with other people, so that they understand what the mapping experience, the mapping effort is going to be. The second stage is investigation. Sometimes it's tempting just to make these things up. Anybody ever just, I'm going to do a journey map, let's just make it up, right? It's what we think, right? Which might be an okay starting point, but chances are you're going to learn things that you don't know by making real world observations. So you want to make it real. You want it to be valid. You want it to be grounded in observation. And that's really what this stage is. So we've kind of framed what we're going to do, whose experience we're going to map, how we're going to tell that story. Now we want to fill it with real world insight. And I think there are 3 sources of information that you can start looking at. The first one is, look at what you already know. A lot of times organizations know more than they know that they know. So try find all those usability studies and marketing reports. There might even be a white paper out there that you can start combing for little bits of information that start informing your opinion, your insights from existing information. And this can be qualitative or quantitative. If you're talking about an online service, look at some metrics and analytics and things like that. But start with existing sources as your base, and don't overlook those. But then you also need to look at the organization itself. So the way that I define mapping experiences is really looking at those 2 halves of the equation. How does the outside world match up with the inside world? individuals, how does that align to an organization? So it means you have to understand how the organization works. And what I recommend as a second stage is to do interviews or research internally, look at the different departments and talk to people in the organization and try to understand what they think the customer experience is. That should be your starting point, I believe. Some people argue with me on that. They say, no, you should always start with the users. I say, no, start with the internal perspective, because then you want to compare that to reality. This can give you a nice hypothesis about what customers or what individuals actually experience. And that's what you want to do then in the third phase, is you want to talk to customers. So sorry, I want to take a step back. So when I talk to internal stakeholders, I actually, these are examples from my own works, from past work, where I sat down with the team and I've asked them to describe what the customer experience is, and we started sketching a workflow in this case. So this is, when you talk about mapping experiences, this is where it starts, right? It doesn't start in Illustrator. It doesn't start in a high fidelity map. It starts with sketches on a paper where together you're building meaning, you're building up an understanding of what the experience might be. So these are some examples of sketches that I did together with some stakeholders. But then finally, you want to compare that to the outside world. You want to go out and do some observations and talk to actual customers. It could also be surveys and interviews as well too. So it's really about getting out of the building, because you're going to find things. You're going to find things that you overlooked or that you assumed were true. The outside world is always a little different. That's one thing that I've learned as a designer, as a researcher, that you build these theories, hypotheses about how people are going to experience your service, and you go out in the world and you find those are never true. There's always some exception to that as well too. And I think designers like to embrace that. That's one of my check boxes for good designers, is that they like to embrace the messiness of human beings, right? They're emotional, they're irrational, they find workarounds, that kind of thing. You want to get at that, because that's where the opportunities for innovation are. That's where opportunities are to do something different. So it's about getting out of the building. And this, by the way, this is a great opportunity to get your team with you, right? So when I've done this type of contextual inquiry, this is visiting people in their offices. I like to bring a business stakeholder along with me, or an engineer. Right? Bring an engineer to somebody's office and have them talk about their experience. Not about how they log into the product, but like, what do you do? And sometimes I find it's the first time that people inside of my teams and organizations have ever talked to a customer, seen a customer in their natural setting. So it's a great way to engage others too during the investigation phase as well too. So you initiate, you try to start a conversation from the very beginning. Do the investigation, involve other people, talking to customers. It's a great opportunity to do that. So the third phase is we're now going to take all of that insight, and now we want to make a compelling diagram based on that. And the goal here is to make it visual. Again, I kind of hinted at the benefits of visualization, that you can tell a very complex story in a very short amount of space. Right? It's not a 50-page report, it's one page, literally. It's trickier to do than you think it might be. But the visualization is a really compelling way to engage others as well too. So you might even do a draft diagram together in a preliminary workshop, where with sticky notes you say, or digital sticky notes, you say, based on what we see, what might a diagram look like? It's a sketch of a diagram, right? Rough scribbles to kind of a physical diagram here on a whiteboard or digital whiteboard. But these are preliminary exercises that I've done with a team, a group of stakeholders, and it can be really engaging. What I tend to find is that regardless of your role, whether you're in marketing or engineering or you're a business strategist, you can almost always find yourself in a map of an experience, right? Because it's all encompassing, end to end. So people can always find themselves or see their relevance of what they do in the experience. So it's a great way to engage a group of stakeholders that have different backgrounds as well too. And that's one of the advantages and one of the goals, I think, of mapping experiences, is that you can kind of cross silos. We talk about organizational silos, or have teams work together. And I've had this happen to me as well too, that I've held a workshop like this, and it's the first time a marketing person met an engineer or something like that. Like I'm literally introducing people inside of the organization to each other. And I think that's great, particularly for designers to be facilitators, right? Which is part of mapping experiences, I believe, is also facilitating, because it's not about the diagram. It doesn't matter if you're a great graphic designer and you can make the best diagram in the world. If you can't get people talking about it and facilitating conversations around it, it's not relevant. It's not going to have the impact that you want. So it's all about fostering these conversations. And you know, this might be then the outcome after you do some drafts and work together. You might then sit down in Illustrator. I believe this was done in Illustrator or Photoshop. Right? It's a pretty nice looking diagram. It's a little blurry here. It's in the book, and I can send this around. It's a really nice diagram, actually. This is for visiting an eye doctor. It's a patient's experience visiting an eye doctor. So at the top, we have the patient's level of what does that say? Distraction? It's not distraction. I have to read it. Dissatisfaction? I don't think it's that either. But this curve here is actually anxiety level here. But then they have some thoughts. What is the patient thinking? What are they feeling? And so it's their thoughts, feelings, and actions. And it's very compact, and it really shows about kind of the highs and lows, the intensity, the questions, it's a snapshot of the patient's experience. And then down below here are all of the things that the doctor's office has to do. The receptionist, the doctor, and then down here, this might even be what we call backstage, right, or below the line of visibility. This might even be like a lab or something that the patient never sees. But it's really trying to match the outside world. This is our observations of the outside world to what the service provider or the product has to do to provide that experience. And it allows you to then diagnose the experience, right? If we're going to say start with the experience, work back towards the technology, we need to understand what the experience is so that we can diagnose our own performance. Where are we doing well? Where are we doing poorly? What can we do better? Where are the opportunities to make a better experience? And that's really the value of these things, is a diagnostic tool to allow an organization to self-reflect and to see where opportunities are. And this is a pretty high fidelity, nicely drawn diagram in Illustrator, but it's not about artistic ability. It's not about artistic ability. And I have some examples coming up where I'll show some examples where it doesn't have to be complex to be impactful. Like, I'll go to this one right here. This is a map of going to a Starbucks. Sorry, slightly American. You have Starbucks here now, though. I think that's something. A Starbucks cafe. This was done by a guy named Eric Berkman. He did some observations of what are the positive factors of visiting a Starbucks and what are the negative factors, right? So the aroma, when you walk in, it smells good. Ooh, that's positive. And then when you wait in line, that's negative. So we took all of those factors and mapped them out on the line at the top. And then everything down here, this is a description of everything that Starbucks has to do to provide that service, right? So it's the outside world and how the technology aligns to that. But it's super simple, right? It's not about graphic design. It's about telling that story and deciding what your scope is, what your focus is, answering those questions that I talked about in the first phase, answering those questions in a visual story that you can then take to a group of stakeholders or take to your team and have a conversation around. It doesn't have to be, it's not about visual design or artistic ability. It's about storytelling. It could even be this, right? Is this map of an experience better than the one of the doctor's visit? I don't know. It depends on what the impact of it was. And if you work for a small startup, this may be all that you need. If you're talking to the CEO of a large bank, yeah, you might want something more like this, right? So it's only appropriate or not appropriate. It's not good or bad by default, and it's not about artistic ability either. So we scope the effort, we make it relevant, we do some observations, and then we form that into a visualization, high fidelity or low fidelity, so that we can have conversations inside of our organization. That's really what the last phase is about, aligning and envisioning. And when I talk about aligning, I'm talking about team alignment. Like, you want to get a shared sense of reality is what I called it. You ever work on a project and people have completely different realities about what you're doing? Like, oh, I thought we were building this, and other people thought they were building this. You want to take this opportunity to get a shared sense of reality, a common understanding about the experience and about what you're doing to provide that experience. So this is really about making it actionable here. And this is where the facilitation really comes in. I talk about it in the book, holding a workshop. So when I I've run lots of projects in different companies in my career, and I always schedule a workshop as part of the mapping exercise. Because here's what you don't want to do. You don't want to do everything that I just told you about and put a PDF as an email attachment and say, what do you guys think about it? Because they might open it, but they're not going to understand it, they're not going to engage with it, and they're not going to engage with each other as well, too. So that's what you want, that engagement with each other. And this is how I think about the workshops that I've planned. You want people to first empathize with the experience. It's really important to first empathize with the individual. Understand what the experience is, but then envision the future and evaluate your ideas, right? So we want to go from empathizing to envisioning to evaluating, and then I'll talk about experiments at the end if we have time. How am I doing on time? Perfect, okay. You have no idea how many slides I have left. All right. So empathize. So this is what mapping experiences looks like, right? It's not about the map. The map is important. The diagram is important because you want it to be something that somebody goes over to and says, "Oh, I want to see more of that." Right. So the map is important, but it's the conversations that are more important, I believe. Right. I also I will always invite people to actually draw on my diagrams because I don't want it to seem final or complete. Because when it looks so perfect, nobody wants to do it. They sit back. I'll leave rows of information blank, or I'll say, hey, I need your help to complete that, and invite people to come up and add to my diagram, or move things around, or something like that, so they're engaged in it. Or do exercises like this, where you do dot voting. Where's the most important point to us? Where's the most important point to the customer? That's what these two different votes were. Then we took a step back, and we saw where those two things aligned, right? It's just a way to have a conversation, right? Or in this one, we were grading, the organization was grading itself on how well it did at each phase. So we usually talk about phases of a journey. We gave school grades. How do school grades go in Buenos Aires? I don't even know. Like we do A, B, C, D. Is 1 to 10? Really? So is 1 good and 10 is bad? 10's good? Okay. This was actually in Germany. I lived in Germany for a very long time. And Germans go from 1 to 6, and 1 is the best, and 6 is the worst. So it's all good. We do AB. You guys know how we do it in the US. So that was 1 to 6. That was in Germany. And I had different breakout groups. So I put the maps up. We talked about it, and then we went to different breakout groups. And I had everybody read through the diagram. Like I literally forced them to read through every step of the diagram. And that's really how you get the empathy. And you always get somebody who goes, oh, I didn't know that happens. So you always learn a little bit. 80% of it might be common knowledge. That's fine, but it's that 20% that you want people to have a conversation about. And in this case, these guys gave a low grade, and these guys gave like a middle grade. It was like for one of these phases. And it was like, what did these guys know that these guys didn't know? Like, so instant conversation. Turns out that the experience really was bad at that point in time. They just didn't know it. That group didn't know. So you want to empathize with the experience, engage the team to understand what the customer is actually experiencing. But then you want to go into envisioning, right? So this is where designers can really lead and facilitate. It's about taking the conversations and the ideas that come out of the discussions and articulating them, making them real, putting them down on paper, sketching. So I will always also bake into a workshop the idea of prototyping or sketching or storyboarding, whatever it might be. That's part of the workshop. It's not about generating ideas. It's about can we actually express these things as a storyboard, for instance. And then you can then start evaluating the ideas right away too, right? Whether it's an internal evaluation, this is just a priority matrix. We use the window frame to do the priority matrix. Or even usability tests. I've invited customers to come in as part of the workshop, and we've evaluated our ideas that we just had in the morning, in the afternoon with users, which, by the way, is a great way to get business stakeholders to participate in usability tests. And guess what happens when I do this? There's always somebody in the group that says, I've never seen this before, right? So the mapping journey is really about engaging people through my 4 steps: initiating, investigating, illustrating, aligning, and envisioning. Again, it's not about artistic ability. It's not about the map. There's no magic answers that come from the map. It's about facilitating conversations with the organization. But it goes on. This is part of a bigger picture, a process, a conversation that goes on in your organizations. There are things that precede this. But the question I always have is what happens after that? I think sometimes that's where we fail as designers. When you look at things like design thinking, it kind of ends. And even if you have a prototype, it just kind of ends there, and you don't necessarily follow through. So I just wanted to finish up. Do I still have time? Okay. I just wanted to finish up with another conversation about where does all this go? What do we do with this information? Great, we've observed the outside world, we've had conversations, now what? And I think we as designers, we need to be facilitators, but we also need to think more about how this is actually then going to have an impact on the business. And that's what I call experimenting. I had that one line that said experimenting. And before I talk about that, I just want to talk about the concept of ideas. We have this idea, this notion rather of, ideas are good. Ideas have a really good brand, right? You guys know the TED Talks? Ideas worth spreading. So there's, and ideas aren't inherently bad. I just think they're overrated. We put too much faith in ideas sometimes, particularly as designers and design thinkers. This is literally the outcome of a workshop that I gave once. Like a photograph of sticky notes on a wall, right? There's no value in an idea. An idea has no value, right? We need to give it value. And I've never experienced an organization, particularly large organizations, but any organization. I've never worked for or with an organization that didn't have enough ideas. For some reason, we measure the amount of success by the number of sticky notes that we use. Right? And I don't know why that's a measure of success, because I don't know any organization that lacks ideas. Does anybody have an organization where we don't have enough ideas? No, seriously. I had somebody say yes once. Yeah, that's our problem. It's generally not the volume of ideas that's the problem, right? The problem is, what do we do with these ideas? How do we make decisions on these ideas? These ideas are far too innocent. They're unripe. There's not enough information to make a decision to go with this idea over that idea. Yeah, we can prioritize them, we can sketch them and prototype them and get user feedback on it. But that doesn't help a business stakeholder actually make a decision to invest time, money, and resources into acting on that idea. And here's why. This is particularly in larger organizations. The larger the organizations, the deeper the valley of death. So the valley of death is actually a term that's been used to describe startups. So if you work for a startup, right, you have an idea, then you start developing that idea. Here, this is research and development. And then you launch the idea, but you're not profitable yet, right? You're not making any money. And the valley of death is the point where either you start making money or the startup ends or fails. And then here we have business success. I think that ideas have a valley of death as well too. That if you put a wall full of ideas, if you throw this into any organization, right, it's just going to go into the valley of death, and our ideas just kind of go away. That's why we have too many ideas, because we just keep generating them and throwing them into the valley of death. That nothing happens to them. There's not enough information for an organization to make a decision to move forward with one idea over another. So what I think we need to do are thinking about ahead of time what I call business value experiments, which is a kind of a translation or a rewording of minimum viable product. You guys know minimum viable product? MVP, Eric Ries's Lean Startup. I just think the term minimum viable product is terrible. It doesn't have to be a product. It's an experiment, it's an idea. Because what we're trying to really do is talk about what's the business value of our idea, not can we build something. But this is an example from a book called Innovator's Hypothesis. Michael Schrage talks about something called the 5x5 framework, where he says, let's take 5 people, give them 5 days to come up with 5 experiments and prove those 5 experiments. They get a budget of $5,000 in 5 weeks' time. The point why I'm bringing this in here is because the outcome of mapping experiences, or the workshops, the types of workshops that I just talked about, the outcome is not ideas, the outcome should be experiments. So you as the facilitator should be setting up the expectations and setting up the motion to come up with experiments, to say, hey guys, we're not done. We've only just started exploring what the experience is and how we're going to work out the technology. We need to do more. And the other point here is about commitment as well too. I've worked with a lot of stakeholders that want a magic pill from me. right? They want the magic UX wand or pixie dust, we say sometimes, right? They want me to come in and do some user research, make a nice picture, and solve their problems. But all I'm doing is put more ideas into a pile or into a valley of death, right? But if I go in and I say, okay, we're going to do these workshops, and I don't know what's going to come out of it, but it's going to be an experiment. It's not going to be something that you can implement. And you got to give me time and budget. And if they go, whoa, wait a minute, then they're not committed to it anyway, right? Which they're going to do whoa. So the point here is that the outcome should be experiments, and that there needs to be a commitment to the outcomes as well too. Otherwise, you end up with a wall of sticky notes. So here's an example from a project in my last company that we worked on. So we did some mapping, right? We went out to observe the outside world, did some interviews with people, put that in a diagram, super simple diagram. In fact, this was done in Excel. This is just a colored Excel table. Super simple. But I invited people to write on it, right? We had a good time drawing on the diagram. And then we generated ideas. Super easy to have this many of ideas. In fact, sometimes like people have had this idea for like a year and they've just been waiting for this moment to put their idea on paper. You ever have that? Like, here's my chance. Right? We've been talking about this at the happy hour at the lunch table for like a year, and now I get to write it down for the first time. So it's easy to generate ideas. There's like 50 ideas, 100 ideas that come out immediately. But that's not the point. We don't want to walk away from this. And I've done that in the past too. Where I say, okay, we're done with the workshop now. Why didn't they get it? They didn't implement. I gave them all the great ideas. Why didn't they implement? Right, I've said that too. So what we did is we continued working on it. We storyboarded, we wireframed, we came up with higher fidelity versions of our ideas. We took those out to some people and started getting feedback on it. It started changing. The ideas that we decided on as a group started changing, right? It had nothing to do with the original idea. But then we created a video. It was just some storyboards, some sketches. We had a sketch artist. I think there were about 16 or 20 panels that went by, and we had a voiceover artist talk for 90 seconds to explain our idea to the world. And then we put it up on a website, invited people here to evaluate our idea. We had them sign up for a free beta. We said, hey, we're going to launch this idea, sign up. And then when you signed up, you got a 2-question survey. What did you like about this idea, and what didn't you like? I forget what the questions were, but we started collecting started collecting feedback on our idea before we built one line of code. In this case, it was software. We didn't build anything. Right? All we wanted to know is this a viable business venture? Should we invest more into this? And by the time we got here, it had nothing to do with the original sticky note. It was almost a completely different idea. And then we got feedback from customers, and the thing that they liked wasn't the thing that we thought we were selling. They liked another completely different part of it. This particular idea actually, became then a feature on our flagship product. Right? It wasn't. We thought that this was going to be a new line of business, and then it turned into an app, and then it turned into a feature, which is fine, because we learned that before we tried to launch a new line of business, right? So I think this is actually a quote from my book, that the conversation doesn't end with this workshop. It doesn't end with the map. It doesn't end with the conversation. It needs to be ongoing as well too. And I think that's an expectation that you need to set up in advance as well too. We're going to do all of this work. We're going to observe the outside world, create a model of it, come together as a group, try to understand that together, and then make something out of that. But that's not the end of the conversation as well too. It needs to be an ongoing conversation. I think the bottom line, particularly for designers, is that this type of activity, mapping experiences, I think it's something that does put us into a facilitation role. It puts us into a leadership role. We may not be at the head of the table, but I think we're able to bring people together. We're able to show people the outside world. We're able to engage in conversations with our organization. So, thanks very much.
Bueno, preguntas. Las que sean en español y si no puedan traducirlas, vamos a intentar traducirlas para que Jim pueda contestar, y si no, arrancamos en inglés.
Hi, this is Nico from Meetup. So when you go out and do some research with your team, how do you start the process to compile all the information to gather it into?
That's actually one of the hardest parts. No, seriously, it is, because it's easy to go out and talk to people and observe the outside world, but then you have to come up with a story, and that story has to fit on a piece of paper. It's not easy to do that reduction of a lot of data. And I think a couple of things about that. I think people have this notion about qualitative research doesn't generate a lot of data. It actually generates a ton of data. If you go out and talk to 12 people for an hour each, there's just a ton of observations that you have. And then you have a customer journey map, and you have a box this big, and you got to fit it in there. I talk about this in the book, but it's really about looking for themes and patterns. It's really about finding the patterns. So the diagram that you create is really a pattern, a model of the outside world, and it's really about it's more of an art than a science, but the ability to spot patterns. Oh, this person said that person said that, this person said that. That's actually a theme. And once you identify the pattern, then it's really about reducing it as much as you can to the most impactful representation of that pattern, and then aligning those patterns into a diagram. It's one of the trickier parts to do in this whole process. But I talk about it a little bit in the book. It's very iterative. It's very iterative. You just need to go over things over and over again until you start seeing the patterns and finding the patterns and just reducing and reducing and reducing. You can also use visualization too, by the way, to help you there. So can you represent it as an icon or a line or a color, that pattern that you see? So a lot of the diagrams, and let me see if I have an example of this back here. I mean, even on this one here, you can kind of see, not too well, but there's different shades of color here to show the different phases. So I use different levels of saturation to show a progression as well too. And that might have been something that I observed, and I have a couple pages of text on that then got represented as color or a line or an icon. But typically it's about a word, it's about finding words. So a lot of mapping experience is about language. And how am I going to take that outside world and retell the story in one word? I'm happy to talk to you. That was a kind of a crappy answer, but it's actually a long answer. So let's talk later.
Hi, Marcos. When you go to an interview, you said you sometimes bring your stakeholders with you. Doesn't that intimidate the user?
It does. I used to have the rule that you never go out with more than 2 people. So it would be me or an interviewer and then somebody observing. And you need to set up that role in advance with both the 2 people and with the interviewee. So you go in and the other person literally doesn't talk unless you point to them and ask them. Because what you don't want are 2 people asking questions at the same time. And what I tend to find is if I start having a conversation with you and there's somebody observing there, you'll have that conversation with me, and they will have that observation role. It's also tricky logistically. I mean, some of the examples that I showed were in lawyers' offices. It's like super confidential. It's like, how do you get 2 people into a lawyer's office and have a conversation with them? So there are lots of logistical challenges with getting multiple people on site, particularly there too. The last company that I worked for, they said, no, we take 3 people out. And I actually got nervous with that a little bit. So you're going to go into a lawyer's office with 3 people and talk to them. So I used to have the rule too, which means then if you're doing this kind of contextual inquiry, you need to set it, and you want to invite an engineer and somebody from marketing, and somebody from product management. You need to kind of rotate them in. You can also rotate the researchers as well too. Usually there's a group of people there, so okay, you're going to go out, you're going to pair up there, you're going to pair up there, you're going to pair up there as well too. But I only go out with 2 people. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
That's okay.
Okay.
It also has to do with when you introduce the observer.
Yeah.
It might be someone of the company you are working for.
Yeah.
And the user might not be comfortable
That's right.
talking about that company.
Right. It's not about the company. The conversation that you want to have is about the person. And I often find, particularly when you go out with salespeople or with like developers, that they want to talk about the product or the login or the sales price and things like, or troubleshooting their problems. They want to use it as a customer support session. It's not about that. It's about tell me what you did yesterday when you got to work. So as the facilitator, you need to take that conversation around away from price or functionality or any of that stuff, and you need to talk about what their experience is. But that's your job as the facilitator, to make sure that that conversation stays on. It doesn't get diverted to the details of a product or something. Here's what I do. If there's any question about the product, like you want to observe people using your product as well too, and then you see them doing something wrong or a better way to do it, save it for the end. So after the interview, say, oh, let's go back to that thing. I want to show you a better way to do it. Or let's go back to that thing. Let's talk about price after that. But don't mix those things in the conversation. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, sure.
Hi, this is Marina from IDF.
Hi.
Do you do a follow-up after you create a model and
That's a great question.
share that with a customer? What happens? Can
That's a great
you share
question.
any
I mean,
experience?
yes, I can. The real answer, like the academic answer, is yeah, you need to validate your model, because otherwise the model, it's a leap of faith on you can try this is the right model. So I have done projects where we did interviews and then we came up with a model and we went back out and we validated that with folks. We did it in more of a focus group situation. So usually when I was talking about interviews, actually just now, I was talking about one-on-one. From those one-on-one interviews, you come up with patterns and you come up with a model. And then what we did is we did focus groups with groups of those interviewees as well too to validate the model. Usually you don't have time to do that though. Like who has time to do that on their project? Like you know what I mean? You generally don't have that luxury to do that. You can do it that way. But there's also an internal validation. This is something that I like to remind people as well too. Because the model is not right or wrong, it's only whether the organization and your team can make sense of it. So I often use the internal validation as really the test point. When you put up a journey map and you say, here's phase 1, here's phase 2, and people start going, no, that's not how I see the world, then you might have the wrong model from their perspective. But typically, if you've engaged people from the very beginning, you build the model together as well too. So the model is arbitrary, right? It's an abstraction of the world, and it's about what the team can come up with as well too. So I think about external validation can be done. We usually don't have time for that, but focus more maybe on the internal validation. Is this the model that the team understands? That's right.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering, what types of questions do you think are most important to ask to get a good background to build your experience maps on? Yeah. Are there any particular questions you would ask?
There are some standard ones, but to some degree it depends on what you set up in the beginning. So I know I went through those 5 questions for the initiation phase really quickly, but it was what's your point of view, what's the scope, what are you going to focus on? And particularly that question, what are you going to focus on? Because when we talk about experience, like how do we describe an experience? It's multifaceted, it's n-dimensional when you think about an experience, right? Typically we talk about actions, thoughts, and feelings, but it could be about a specific context, like a mobile usage, it could be about feelings, it could be about how they interact with other people, it could be about how much effort they have to put into the experience. So when you're scoping the effort, you need to think about those facets of information that you're going to actually represent in the diagram, and those often become the questions that you're going to have as well too, right? If you've also, by the way, done a draft model of your diagram, remember I showed those sketches where people were drawing a workflow with me, that also then starts putting a hypothesis of what the experience is. So very often when I do those interviews, I start off with the question, tell me about yourself and what you do in your own words. And then I like to ask what the typical day is. A typical day question. What's a typical day look like for you? And the answer is almost always, I don't have a typical day. And then you say, what did you do yesterday? And then they tell you what they did yesterday. And you say, well, is that what you usually do? And they say yes or no. And then you say, well, I thought you didn't have a typical day. But, so I ask about the person, typical day. But then the rest of my interview is really going through the information that I know I need for my diagram, because I've already defined what I need for my diagram, which would be, tell me about the first time you did X, Y, and Z, whatever the service or the product is, whether it's banking, tell me about your investment banking experience. How did you decide to do investment banking? How did you feel about that? What were the problems? Guess what? That's actions, thoughts, and feelings. And then you move on to, so my discussion guide almost resembles the journey that I think I'm gonna have. It's just a hypothesis at that point in time, but it's just a way to guide my discussion. So we also don't have time, by the way, in business contexts, we don't have time to just take months and months to do research. So you have to go in very surgically and get the information that you know you're gonna put in here, and that's the basis of the questions. It's usually a reflection of the diagram. I like all these research questions. I love talking about research, so these are great questions for me.
Hi, I'm Nicholas. I'm still here. When do you know that your job is done? Because maybe after putting down information, the company wants to do different things that the way that you've been doing. Right. So maybe you get back to the process. And,
it's a good question. I think the way that we've been framing it here, particularly in this conversation about research, is really about not getting into a product workflow or a specific technology. It's really about understanding what people are trying to do and what they're trying to get done. And if you can understand that, generally the longevity of the information, and by that I mean how long that information stays valid, extends. Right? So if you're really looking at what do lawyers do, or what is banking about, and you're really looking at it at the human level, not at a task level or using a specific device, but what are they trying to do, and that's what you capture. The diagram, the lifespan of the diagram is going to be longer. And I've seen things like mental model diagrams. That's a specific type of a diagram, by the way. That 3 years later you go back and look at it, and you're like, this is still what people do when they do banking, right? Because it's devoid. It's absent of technology as well too. So the answer to the question is that typically when you create these things, that you're not going to revisit it every quarter and change it every quarter. You generally want it to be something that you can look at and revisit in a year or so. Say, oh, this has changed, or our strategy has changed. So it moves at about the pace of strategy. Like hopefully your companies aren't changing their strategy every week. Right? But maybe every once in a while there might be a new competitor or something that changes in the market where you have to change your strategy. That's a point when you might want to change this. And that's really why I call these strategic deliverables. These are strategic documents. They really inform the deepest strategic thinking, I think. So the time spans are about the same time spans as thinking about your strategy. Did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay, good.
Hi. So you've been talking about how you do this, how you've been doing this for a long time, and I assume, tell me if I'm not correct, you've been iterating on this process you have, you've been making it better.
Yes.
So in terms of lean and stuff, so what are your metrics? How do you consider yourself successful, and how have you improved that?
Yeah.
What do you look at in your own process to be better?
The number of sticky notes that come out. I seriously used to use that metric. We used to, I worked at a company where we used to calculate the number of sticky notes that we would need for the workshop. We never go into a day-long workshop without 1,000 sticky notes. We always bought 1,000 sticky notes. We knew how many sticky notes. No, I don't know if there's a metric around it, like a hard number. But I've tried to measure this before. But you can look at things like, one thing that I look at is how often I hear other people using the terms that we used in that workshop or that I have in the diagram. How often people grab parts of this or refer back to this. Because I always say I win. When I see, and I've seen this happen where a business stakeholders presentation had my stuff in it. I win, that's great, that's perfect. I think the other thing you could look at too is the number of decisions that are made based on this as well too. So soft, I don't know how you'd quantify this though, actually. you have any ideas? We can talk about it. I've talked to people about that, quantifying things. But you know, there's a lot of things in business that you don't quantify. Strategy, marketing. There's lots of things that we don't have hard numbers against. So is this a leap of faith? Maybe it is. Is this a fad? I don't know. Everybody's talking about this right now, right? Are we going to be talking about this in 10 years? I don't know. I need a peer.
Maybe AI puts other jobs.
What's that?
Maybe AI puts other jobs.
Maybe I need a beer to have that rest of this conversation. Although I do have kind of an answer, but it's a longer answer. So I'm flying to Chile on Santiago on the weekend, and I'll be at the Interaction South America conference. Anybody going to that? So that's, there you go. Oh yeah, there are many people. Okay, I'll see you there. But I'm going to give a talk on a topic called jobs to be done, which is related to this, because like I said, you know, what you're really trying to capture here is what is the person trying to get done. Is their fundamental goal, their fundamental desired outcome. And there is a technique within jobs to be done where you can quantify that and look at how important a job is to someone and how satisfied they are in getting that done, and actually quantify that. I've worked on a project where we did that. We quantified importance versus satisfaction for jobs to be done that we observed qualitatively, and then we were able to pinpoint where we think the opportunity is to improve the experience, is to attack those things that are important but they're dissatisfied with. We can talk more about that method too, but I'm going to be talking about that at the conference.
I have a question. I don't know.
Well, congratulations for your talk. It was amazing.
My pleasure.
I was thinking when you was talking about, is it possible to apply this technique to commercial websites? It's like a personal question because currently I'm working on a commercial website for on a big project that it has almost nothing. When the goal is to convert, I assume that in that case is the content the most important thing in a commercial website.
Maybe.
Yeah. How can you apply this to on some kind of project?
So first of all, I get the question a lot, like, does this apply to my domain? Does this apply to that domain? I did a podcast with someone who was, she designed on e-learning or online education courses. She wasn't an instructor, but she designed e-learning. She wanted to use mapping to understand the experience of taking an online course. I've seen this apply to just about any domain that I've ever worked in. So far, I haven't found a domain where you, as long as there's a human experience involved, you can think about mapping it. Right? So commercial website, yeah, you can talk about that. I think the question that you have is, what's my scope? Where is it to interact? At what level of granularity am I looking at? What's the focus going to be? And that's some of those questions that I talked about in the initiate phase. But it's provided that you can talk about whose experience it is, when it begins or ends, what you're going to focus on. You could apply this absolutely to any service. I wouldn't want to talk about the website though. It's really about the experience around the website, right? Because that's what you're interested in. And you want to see how that website fits into their life or what they're trying to get done with that website. But yeah, absolutely.
Right. Yeah. Because the project is for the freight transportation market. It's like focusing on truckers, shippers, and it's like a multi-target product. And I'm very like stuck in thinking which is the best content to provide in this section and in order to convert and go to that section.
Absolutely. A friend of mine, Donna Leachow, just wrote a book called Story Mapping, where it's very specific around creating content that tells a story. So she draws this dramatic arc, is what she calls it. So you map out an experience that you want people to have with your content, and then you think about how you're going to tell that story with content. And it's kind of, I talked with her about doing like a workshop together, because it kind of complements what I do here as well too. But it's a similar thought, which is, we have this idea of experience, like people experience content, they experience my product or service, and I can map that out, and I can use visualization, as a way to create a service, whether it's content or functionality or face-to-face service. I can map that back to the experience that I understand as well.
Hello.
Hi.
I have a question. Do you feel in some point overwhelmed that all these sticky notes? When do you think it's time to say stop to the research? Because
That's a really good question. When do you say stop to the research? Because you're like, do I do 2 interviews? Do I do 4 interviews? 20? Do I do 40 interviews? When do I stop? Generally, that question is you don't even have that question, because it's a practical question. Crap, I only got 2 weeks, and we have budget to talk to 6 people, right? The question is answered for you before you begin. But let's assume that you can just continue to do research. I think it has to do with pattern recognition. Even though you might do like a formal analysis of the insights that you collect, as the researcher, you should also in your mind be kind of building up an understanding of the experience that you're going to be mapping. And when you start hearing things over and over again, that's a signal that you've uncovered something. This is a fundamental pattern of how people do banking, or whatever the subject is that you're looking at. When you start, as the researcher, when you start seeing this repetition or this very strong kind of cluster of insight, then you can usually say, okay, I think I have enough here, and move on. And then when that happens there, then you move on. That kind of thing. Which I've almost never had the luxury of saying, keep doing research. I have 2 instances where we did like more research than we needed. We had like 40 interviews, stuff like that. And I also worked on an academic project with the university, and they were doing most of the research, and they just kept researching. So yeah, you can just research yourself to death, right? Just research yourself to it, right? Just spinning around like a whirling dervish or something like that. So, but generally we have a limited amount of time and a limited amount of scope anyway. And your job is to really find the patterns. As soon as you start finding the patterns, and you have confidence in the patterns, and your team has confidence in the patterns, then you can say, okay, this is good enough for now.
One more question. Your consideration of the experience of the customer with your product, service, or whatever. Yeah. It's like an inbound contact from them to us, or do you also measure maybe the company effort to contact that people, and what's the experience? Yeah. In that conversation, maybe like a phone campaign or something. I think
it's bi-directional. I tried to make this point at the beginning. I'm just going to go back to this slide right here. You're not supposed to do this. I tell you don't do this. I always say don't do this. There you go. This one here. I think it's both. We don't just want to understand the customer's experience and then walk away. We want to understand how the organization fits into that. We want to understand both parts of the equation. Right? Start with the experience, work back towards the technology. So we need to understand the technology, whether that's software or the technology is a business model. So when we talk about technology, it could be whatever it takes to provide a service. It could be a human face-to-face service, right? So I believe when you do this type of work, you have to understand both. You don't just want to understand this. You want to understand how the business fits into that as well too. So we have these 2 halves, the individual and their experience, and the organization and what they do as well too. That's why I say, as mappers of experiences, map makers, you need to understand the organization almost as much as you need to understand the experience as well too. Does that answer your question? Is that what you're talking about? Yeah. Okay. That's the premise of my book, is that it's 2 circles, one individual, organization. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question. How do you work when the users involved in these workshops are very reluctant to work with these mapping tools?
Yeah, that's a good question. It does go back to the idea of diagrams being compelling documents. That you want it to be, I don't know what the good word for compelling is. Do you know compelling, like attractive? Like, I can't not look at that thing. So you want that to be the centerpiece of the conversation. It's just this thing that people want to engage with, that is attractive for them. I think you also want to set it up in a way that people from different backgrounds can find themselves in it. So when you do something like this, right, become aware of a service, then you become a customer, then you onboard, then you use the service, right? This is like marketing people go, oh, this is interesting. Salespeople go, oh, this is, and developers, oh, here's the service that we provide, right? That kind of thing. So you want to build it in a way that will speak to different stakeholders. So off the bat, they find relevance in here as well too. So a compelling document, relevant to the people you're going to be you're speaking with as well too. I think also when you structure the workshop, and I talked about when I'm doing it again, it's also about this, right? It's about getting people up on their feet, engaging in fun activities. Not just help me write out the diagram, but let's play a game around, prioritization game or something like that, right? It's about engaging people in that way. Even if you do all that, though, you're always going to get somebody going like this, right in the back. I ignore them. Just let the rest of the workshop go around them like a rock in the stream. Just let. If you have too many of those people, though, then it derails or gets your whole workshop off track, right? So you also want to find people who are willing and champions, and I talk about that in the book too. Finding a champion of this. You don't want to do this in secrecy and then expect that people are just going to latch onto it. Right? You want to find a sponsor or champions, people who are attracted to this, and work with them from the very beginning. And those are the people that you loop into the conversations around the stakeholder mapper. Those are the people that you bring to the interviews as well too. And I think the bottom line is, the real answer is what I was talking about here. It's about engaging people early on, right? Because you don't want this to be, I'm working by myself and I'm doing all this magic stuff that you don't know what it is, and here you go. I'm done. Because that's when you're going to get the most people folding their arms and standing in the back. But if they've been working with you, more or less throughout the whole entire process, they're generally engaged. And I find more and more, companies and organizations are like asking for this, right? And not my last job, but the job before that, I was an external consultant. I worked for an agency, and we had people literally calling us up and saying, "We want a journey map." So that's kind of a good sign when you're not trying to. You're not trying to convince people that this is valuable who don't want to be convinced in the beginning anyway. So did that answer your question?
Maybe it's a related question, but I have my own answer, but I would like to know your answer. You talk about a lot about engagement. What happens when people ask for user experience, when they talk, they know they want user experience, but when you say, hey, you try to engagement, they may be, all right, I don't have time or something like that.
Right, that's the magic pill. People want user experience to be something that takes work off of them, and then we come in and say, no, you're going to work more. Right? No, now you got to clear time in your schedule to go out and talk to customers and find time for my workshop. Just do your magic and let me know when you're done. Right? I got that locked as a user experience person.
Yeah, I wanted to know if that ever happened to you and how.
All the time. All the time. They want the magic UX bill. They want us to be medicine men. Take work off of them and do something. But it's not. And I think that's the Steve Jobs quote, is you've got to start with the experience and work back towards the technology. It's not some people have to start with the experience, and designers we need to hire people to look at the experience. It's everybody, the whole company does. It's not about designers having some magic wand. It's about thinking about your business in a fundamentally different way. And not everybody got that message yet. Even though Apple and lots of other companies are wildly successful by valuing, not valuing in the sense of hiring more UX designers, but truly valuing design perspective, user experience, and those types of things. Not everybody's kind of there. So there's this array, there's an array of more mature organizations and less mature organizations. So one thing you want to do, this does get back to the other question too, is you want to understand the maturity of your organization. And in the last company that I worked in, I actually came in and they were actually less mature than I thought they were. And we came in with a very sophisticated process of math actually, and they weren't able to like make the mental leap up there. So you need to think about where your organization is and how you're gonna, where your team is and how you're actually gonna get them on board. You don't want to overshoot either. Does that make sense? Like if they're at a 2 and you're coming in at a 4 on a scale from 1 to 5, you're probably going to overshoot that organization. So you need to be sensitive to the maturity of the organization and think about what they really need. And that's about making it relevant. Talking about, you know, this needs to be relevant to people.
Hi. What do you think about having 2 different diagrams for the same abstraction? One to use internally and one from the client. I've seen that in many cases, and definitely I want your opinion about, you know, building bridges between, you know, both abstraction and how to avoid, you know, falling into the chasm that you have.
Sure. Yeah. How many diagrams do we need? Fundamental question you need to answer. Typically, what I like to do is think that I can express everything that we need to do in one diagram until you figure out that it's not going to work that way because the people or the experiences that you're mapping, just you can't express that in a single diagram. So there may be a need for multiple diagrams from the outset. You might need, typically you find this when there's like a buyer and a seller experience, right? If you're working with eBay, I worked with eBay for a while. There's a buyer and a seller, right? Those are completely different experiences, or teacher and student. They might overlap, but typically you might need multiple diagrams. But even within that, what I typically find is that you're gonna need multiple layers or multiple versions of the same story. So it's really about storytelling. Think about that, right? We observe the outside world and capture that, reduce it in by patterns and capture that. There might be like a backstage or a master document that you keep for yourself, but then when you go talk to the CEO of the bank, right? It's just 3 bullet points, right? Because they like, you get 1 slide. You got 5 minutes in 1 slide. Can you still talk about the story that you want to tell very quickly? So typically what I'll find is that you might have multiple versions of the same journey map or the same experience. High level for high level stakeholders, there might be a workshop version, and then there might be like a working version for the design team, the people actually building the thing as well too. But typically, if you come up with a more complex model, you can make simpler models from it really quickly. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about? More or less. But yeah, but it might be internal, external, or you might have different versions of the same thing for different groups of stakeholders. Yeah, all the time. And by the way, I like to think about different formats as well too. Like, you know, you might print this out or digitally use a whiteboard like Mural. But typically that's kind of like the full version. There might be a PowerPoint version. We did a workshop once and we took a piece, we laminated